comes to sound design, often it's really just about coming up with gritty, interesting, and punchy sounds, especially for bass, without having to use a lot of plugins and a lot of exterior processing. I'm going to show you the first way to do that using just Bronner Tube. If you listen to what this sound would have been like without it, it's nothing near what it is now. Very uninteresting and pretty weak. All I did with one voice is just turn on Bronner Tube all the way up, and you get this really strong bass. The reason I'm using one voice with Bronner Tube is that if I use more, listen to what happens. They kind of start to trample on top of each other rather than work together. So when you're using Bronner Tube, I would advise trying just one voice. Again, back to the original. Let's see if there's another way to do it without using Bronner Tube. If you were to turn up the number of voices to, let's say, 8, let's hear what that does. It does sound bigger, but you get this kind of sloppy situation going. It's not really working all as a single unified bass sound. So we fix that by clicking on Restart via Gate in the oscillator page. So I use this guy a lot to try to get that punchy attack. And there's a couple of differences between picking the Bronner way and picking the oscillator way. The Bronner way, you have the ability to macro and control how much drive and how much dry wet, if you want to make some interesting macros that way. Restart via Gate is cool because a pro and a con at the same time is when Restart via Gate is on, listen to what happens here with pitch cutoff. It creates a flange effect in like 2 seconds. So that can be restricting because now you can't really use this for anything subtle, but then you get a flanger too if you want. So try both, Bronner Tube in a single voice or lots of voices and Restart via Gate, and you'll get a pretty gritty bass sound. Next macro we're going to talk about is creating a diver effect with a macro. Notice how when the diver macro is turned all the way down, it still does this kind of filter dive, but not a pitch one. When I turn the diver on, these oscillators and this envelope are all working together to make a pitch dive. That's usually something you would imagine is created by a pitch bend, but in this case, we're having an actual envelope and macro do that, not just us bending it manually here. So quick note, notice that the macro is going to actually bring this envelope to life. So I'll just bring this up. You just have to know that these guys would have been activated by the macro. The difference between this and other pitch dive envelopes that we've talked about before are normally I'll have this up several octaves and it will only go up to that top maximum for a moment. Just jump up and then come quickly down, and that gives it this quick attack phase. That's not what I wanted to do here. I wanted to hear the note before it dived out. That's created by using this S loop. Without the S loop, this is kind of what this looks like. It would have just been a quick up and down. That should sound pretty familiar. Use this on subkicks, use this on plenty of stuff. With the S loop on, we get a little bit more control though, because we can hear the sound first before it bails. So it's actually nice with this acid bass kind of thing, because you're not just quickly going through this attack phase, you get to hear the sound. Decay is what decides how long the sound goes. Another thing you'll notice here is that I've got this macro 2 bringing all of these an octave down. It's not sidechained, it's just also bringing it an octave down right away when this macro is turned up. Now why do I have it that way? I want both of these, whether it's in the off or the on position, I want them to start at the same note. By bringing this an octave down, I make that happen, because the envelope is ultimately going to make it go 1 octave higher and then dip out of that. Listen to what it would have sounded like if I didn't have this octave to make up for that. So the envelope shape kind of makes sense because it goes an octave up and then comes an octave down back to the original. But we don't want that to be the sound. We want it to be like a dive out kind of sound, like you hear all the time. So that's why we bring in this extra octave to get the hell out of there. Last thing I'm going to talk about is creating tone macros versus crazy sounding macros. Why and when to use each. For a gritty bass or one interesting sound that you use for big room or use just for a quick moment in a drop, those should really try to be tone macros. And what I mean by tone macros is that's a lot of what this acid rain patch was all about. Changing the tone slightly. Let me give you a quick demonstration of what these macros do. They don't do too many crazy performer LFO kinds of changes. They pretty much just slightly alter the tone. The reason that's good is when you start putting them all together and shifting this one and automating everyone together, you're going to get some very, very interesting tones. That's what makes this drop here sound pretty good. Let me show you what this drop would have sounded like without all this automation here. So using these tone macros that aren't going to just do anything ridiculous allows you to have still a sweet drop that sounds pretty much the same throughout, but it's going to evolve throughout. So it's not boring and it's not like, oh, there's a standard loop. So listen to now with the automation in there. That's an example of when and why you want to use tone macros. How to do that, it's pretty straightforward. You have a lot of filters that you could just quickly automate, and that'll give you the ability to change the tone. Use your modulation oscillator. Another cool trick I did was I only had one oscillator here for the most part, but then one of my macros, number 5, turns this one off and these ones on. So that's pretty cool. It's a good way to get different tones, but subtle stuff, nothing too crazy. Now for our crazy macro section, I'm going to bring in a supersaw that I made recently that you'll probably see in a video soon. Supersaws in general aren't going to be doing a whole lot, so they tend to be pretty background sounds. You'll have a sharp piercing lead going over this. That's the reason that we're not going to end up using tone macros, because it's already just a pretty fundamentally background sound. We want to use crazy macros to make it stand out at times and become more interesting and not a background sound. So check out these macros. Movement, tremolo. Let's try tone wub. Goes back and forth between tuned tones instead of just like a standard wobble. Dominator. Let's see what this is. I don't even know. Kind of a smaller 8th note tremolo. And then this one's pretty ridiculous. That sounds almost too crazy to be used, but that's kind of the idea with this, is that I can now automate this to like really build up or transition a sound. It's not going to be a main sound like you would find in a drop, so we need to make it support those big sounds and those big leads by creating interesting macros. If all I did was like do a standard low pass filter on this, that'd be pretty boring and nothing exciting. That would kind of just be like this single brighter macro. It makes it a little bit brighter, sure, but it's not going to do anything to like fundamentally make your song sound sick. So as these videos continue, try to look at whether I'm using pretty simple and tone macros versus crazy, fundamentally changing morphing macros. So this one's one of the first ones where it's a remake instead of just doing my own stuff, just because I got pretty excited when I made this sound. I'll get to the Subkick one at some point, but if you guys have requests for more remakes, be happy to check those out. As always, send any mastering requests to ryan@occstudios.com, and I'll see you guys next time.